We have heard some absolutely incredible stories, and I've really valued the insights that have been given. There are some images on the screen there of some of the women that have been talked about. And one of the things that I found really inspiring is also the stories of individuals, particularly the sharing that Tracy and Graham have done throughout this series. Because we've heard about the stories of the women in the Bible, but we've also heard about some of the stories of people in our church and of people in our communities. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it can be a little bit hard when you're surrounded by the brokenness and you're surrounded by that reality of life to work out where the hope and the restoration and the healing actually comes from. And it's interesting because I've been reading through a blog that I shared that I took offline, and I've been sorting it out and putting it together into a slightly more usable, shareable format. And I've been reading through some of the things that I wrote during the process of growing our family. And some of it has been quite challenging reading for me because I've looked at and reminded myself of how challenging and difficult some periods of my life has been and my children's lives have been. And it can be really overwhelming and really difficult and really hard. And I really love and can totally get on board with this idea that as a church community, we want to try and find ways of offering hope and restoration and healing to the people that we walk with through life. But I think the thing that can be really tricky is thinking about what does that hope and restoration actually look like in practice? And what does it feel like when the reality can be quite messy, it can be quite painful, and it can be quite difficult to see sometimes a way through. And I wonder whether, just pausing for a moment, if you were to recall to mind some of those tricky times in your life, what they would be. Maybe you're in them now. Maybe it was last week. Maybe tricky times come and go. But I bet every single one of us has got a story that we could tell and some difficult stuff that we are carrying. And let's not pretend that's easy. And that's why I really like the word reality, because it's not about pretending. It's not about making it up. It's not about putting it under the carpet and putting a brave face on all the time. And I know I've shared about how powerful that can be before. And so as we go through this morning, thinking as well about the fact that we're in the process of Lent and we are looking towards Easter Sunday, I want us to reflect on that idea of hope and restoration as we look at the story of Esther together. And look at it as well in the light of what Jesus did when he came to earth and walked with us and died and then was resurrected. And I haven't printed these slides out, so I'm going to need to try and remember what slides come next, so bear with me a little bit. And I'm hoping you can read the questions on the screen, and I'm hoping to just throw out some thoughts, which might hopefully help us ponder, might help us reflect a little bit. What happens when pain is given purpose? What happens and what if connection brings healing? And I guess the big one is, what if we are carriers of the kingdom for such a time as this? So let's have a little look at the story of Esther. Now, in my work, I have learned quite a lot about artificial intelligence and using AI. And I use ChatGPT, and full disclosure, one of the things you have to do, and it's really important to do, is to be transparent when you've used it. I have used it to create this movie poster image of Esther. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the story of Esther, which we're going to do together in a minute, that I don't think it would be I think it would be very at home on a Hollywood movie screen. There are villains. There's a very clear redemption story. There are people who get their comeuppance. There's U-turns, there's twists, there's plots to kill. There's people preparing gallows for one person and then them being used for the person who built them. I mean, it's full of drama. And what we're going to do is we're just going to have a little look at that story for a few minutes together. So a bit of context for the non-3 people who don't know as much about Esther, of the people that waved at me earlier on. It was set around 486 to 465 BC. It's set in Persia, which is the equivalent of modern-day Iran. And we'll hear in a moment that King Xerxes, I think I'm saying that right. I don't know. We'll make it up. We're going to go for King Xerxes. He was the king over the whole of the land from Ethiopia to India. And we've got a world map in our house. That's quite a big area. But this particular set of events was set in Persia. Now, the Jews are in exile still, and the book of Esther follows the stories of the Jews when they are still in exile. So they're not in their home country. They are not necessarily welcome in the place that they are living. And it runs concurrently with the story of the Jews who have gone back to Jerusalem and are restoring the temple in Ezra. So that's just a little bit of kind of the scene setting. Now, I asked ChatGPT to summarize for me in 100 words the story of Esther, and that is nice and small, and I can't even read that, which I was planning on doing for you guys. I don't know if you can read that, but ultimately, it is about Esther being courageous and wise. It is a redemption story set in the Persian Empire. Paraphrasing a little bit, the king throws a massive party, requests Queen Vashti, his queen at the time, to come and join him, and she says no, for reasons we'll look at in a minute. Then he throws her out. Then he calls all the virgins to Persia, and then he picks Esther to be his queen. And then there's a bit of plotting. There's a character called Haman, who I imagine for some reason a little bit like Jafar from Aladdin. I don't know why, but it's just that sort of sneaky kind of, a little bit kind of wanting to get on the right side, very manipulative, tries to kind of get his own way, greedy, not a very nice man at all. And he gets in with the king, and then ultimately he gets grumpy because Mordecai won't bow to him. And so then he decides that the whole of the Jewish people need to be killed. So he goes to the king and says, all the Jewish people need to be killed. I think that's a fitting thing because one man won't bow to me. I mean, anyway, doesn't sound entirely rational to me, but however, that's what happened. And then Esther, who is the queen, is asked by her uncle, who is the person who cares for her because she is an orphan, to use her position as queen to get an audience with the king to try and save the Jewish people. And quite incredibly, and we'll look at this a little bit more together in a minute, that's what happens, and she does it, and she manages it. And the decree can't be overturned, but what happens is the Jewish people are allowed to defend themselves, so that they can then defend themselves. Haman ends up dying, and then Mordecai and Esther end up with the king. And the king starts off not very nice and seems to come good in the end. So it's quite a story with quite a lot in there, but we're going to focus on a couple of characters in particular. And the first one is the king. Now, there's about, I think it's 11 chapters in the book of Esther, and I thought it was interesting just to unpack a little bit who King Xerxes was, because as we consider the actions that Esther took, it's in understanding exactly who she was going up against that really makes what she did so remarkable. So we hear that he reigned over the provinces from India to Ethiopia. He's a very powerful man. And the first chapter sees him throwing a party, a celebration, for 180 days. So that's about 6 months. I've never been to a party that's lasted more than a day, let alone 6 months. I don't know how. And it goes into a lot of detail. I mean, it sounds like an amazing party. It's lavish. There's a lot going on. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is he very clearly says to everybody, make sure there's enough wine so all the men get drunk. Okay? And then in that context, the king asks, I'm going to go forward a bit. The king asks for his queen to be brought. And he doesn't go and ask her. He sends, I think it's 6 men to go and say, I want you to get yourself ready, and I want you to come to the party, and I want everyone to see how beautiful you are. and I want them to ogle over you, and I want them to look at how wonderful my queen is. And she said no. And this is an image that Jen painted of Vashti, and she's very clear. She wanted to paint her with rage and with anger. I wonder how she felt when those men approached her and said, "We want you to put on your crown." It's very specific. "Put on your crown and come and see these men." And she said no. And flipping back a moment, it said, "This made the king furious and he burned with anger." And there are some words there as we start to build a picture of what this king is like. He's greedy, he's influential, he's distracted by beauty, he's quick to anger. And so when Vashti said no, I wonder what she was expecting was going to happen. I really hope in that situation I would have had the courage to say no to. I don't know whether I would. And there's a really lovely phrase which says, "How strong is your yes if you never say no?" And that's a lovely little phrase, but it's a really hard one. And I think it's incredible that she had the strength to say, "No, I'm not going to do what you're asking of me because it's demeaning and it's degrading and it goes against what I believe is right." And so what ends up happening is the king immediately consults with his advisors. And the word immediately is in there, so quite impulsive, I would say. I'm also curious because he seems to want to ask other people's opinions rather than necessarily having an idea of what he wants to do himself. I feel like he might be, I don't know, he needs a little bit of moral support. And his advisors essentially said, "You need to banish Vashti, and then you need to send a decree from Ethiopia to India to tell every man that he can have control over his wives or wife, and they need to do as they're told." I mean, that is a fair reaction for one person not doing what's asked. And then I've included the quote from chapter 7, which is much later, but it does talk about the fact that his anger subsided only after somebody was impaled on a pole. I mean, I get angry sometimes, but I mean, that's an entire other level of something needing to happen for someone to then settle and not be angry anymore. We're talking about somebody who is impulsive, who is rage-filled, who is emotionally driven, who is volatile, who's impressionable, who is unpredictable. And so this king goes to the empires and says, "I want you to bring all the virgins to me, and I'm going to pick a new wife." Because the other thing that's interesting is after he's had his reaction and he's banished Vashti, he then thinks, I just smiled when I saw this. It says, "But after Xerxes' anger subsided, he began thinking about Vashti." And I just think, I almost wonder whether he's thinking, "Oh gosh, maybe I made the wrong decision." Which is where I just get I don't know, my thought is he is impulsive. He does things without thinking about them and then potentially comes to regret them afterwards. But he ultimately wants a new wife. He wants to find somebody new. And if you read about it, it's not nice reading. Because then we've got Queen Esther, who is one of the virgins that is brought into the harem in the palace and is groomed for long periods of time. And what it does is it describes the process that these women had to go through. And before they're summoned to the king, they have to spend 12 months getting ready before they can go to the king. And at that point then, the king will have sex with them and then decide whether or not he wants to continue kind of with that person and whether or not that lady is going to be his wife or not. I mean, I just can't even begin to imagine the experience of those women because it wasn't just one. Ethiopia to India, that's a lot of ladies. A lot of girls. And so we've got Queen Esther who found favour with the king. And Esther was a Jew. She was in exile. We read that she's an orphan. She's exceptionally beautiful because she captured the king's eye and she was the one that he chose. She was essentially kidnapped, she was groomed, and she was potentially sexually exploited. And that's the position that Esther is in. when she then has to have a conversation with her uncle, who's been keeping an eye on what's going on. And we don't have time this morning to dig into all of the details about what kind of the story of Haman and of Mordecai and why the Jewish people were going to be killed, but they were. That was the decree. But Esther has a decision to make. Is she going to go before the king that I've just described and ask for permission for her Jewish people to not be killed? I don't know that I would want to go and have that conversation with that man. I don't know whether any of you guys in that situation would feel bold enough to go into that conversation with that man. And chapter 4 of the book of Esther has possibly one of the most famous quotes, which was on the fake movie poster at the beginning of the message. And it talks about for such a time as this. And Esther's uncle says to her, maybe you are in this moment, in this position, for such a time as this. And Esther has to weigh that, and she has to make a decision as to whether or not she is going to go before the king. And I'm just going to read what she did, because she is smart and she is clever. And she knows who she's about to go and have a conversation with. And so she's clearly made a bit of a plan. So this is chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her his gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And just as a slight aside, if the king hadn't thought it was okay, she would have been killed. Okay, so that's where the stakes are. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What have you requested? Even up to half a kingdom it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and my full request, let the king come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question." So she doesn't go straight in there and say, this is what I want and this is what I need. She's smart and she's wise and she is strategic and she knows the king. And she thinks, what is the best way for me to be able to gain his ear and have him hear me and have him listen? And so, as well as being all the things at the top of the slide, she's all those things at the bottom. And she is considered. And I feel like there's a bit of dignity there in the way that she's choosing to act. She's able to influence the king and influence the outcome for the Jewish people in the most incredible way because she was brave. Now, I think it's really easy sometimes to read this story and to see Esther as a victim, which she absolutely is. But what I find so inspiring is that she used the position that she was in to bring about the most incredible future for the Jewish people. And there was a vulnerability to Esther, which she was able to harness and use. And again, the picture on the screen is one that Jen has created. And when you read about what Jen has written, she was criticised for painting her in this particular way. But she was very clear because she wanted to illustrate that Queen Esther used what potentially could be her vulnerability to become a strength. And as I've reflected on the story of Esther, a few things have kind of really stuck in my mind. And I think that the idea of for such a time as this is a small phrase. It's a really powerful phrase. And I wonder if we could sit with it for a few moments. Esther was a Jew in Persia. She didn't choose her circumstances. She did choose to act courageously and to take a step of faith. So often we don't choose the situations that we are in. God doesn't want painful and difficult things to happen to us. But as we talked about at the beginning of the session, or as I talked about at the beginning of the session, the reality life is messy and it's hard and it's difficult and it's wonderful and it's joyful and it's everything in between. And sometimes it's just fine. And that's fine too. How are you? I'm fine. Sometimes it genuinely is just fine. But the reality is life is everything. And I wonder how we might approach life differently if we knew and thought about the fact that God was calling us into situations, or maybe calling us to act in certain ways in the places that we find ourselves in, sometimes of our choosing and sometimes not. Would it change anything? Would it impact the way that we talk about our faith or the way that we interact with those around us? We're called to be carriers of the kingdom into every situation that we find ourselves in. We're called to be salt and we're called to be light. And the verse in Timothy I find a really encouraging one, which talks about how we are not supposed to act out of fear, but out of power, love, and self-control. Now, we might not be going up against a tyrannical, rage-filled, lusting leader of kingdoms, but there are probably going to be situations that we can think of in our lives where we've been just as overwhelmed and find things just as difficult. And maybe they feel just as unconquerable. But Esther's story is so inspiring because it teaches us that wisdom, a bit of strategic thinking, a bit of reflection, being courageous, being bold, being obedient, having faith, are all those qualities and characteristics that are worth just pausing on, dwelling on, and trying to really put into practice. Because I wonder if she knew how it was going to end. I don't think she did. And the other thing that I reflected is that Esther didn't have Jesus. And what a different position we're in today, knowing that we have Jesus who can come and can work in our lives, and he died and he rose again. And as a result, we can be in a relationship with God. But I can imagine that taking that initial step to have that audience with the king was absolutely terrifying for her. But she spoke out for her people, and she used that as a window of opportunity to speak out for those around her. I also wonder whether there are times in our lives where those painful bits and those difficult bits are actually the things that allow us to really speak God's love and his grace and his healing into the lives of other people around us. And there's been some stories that I've encountered in my work. And there's meetings that I often sit in with parents talking about complicated children. And when I talk to the parents, I talk from a position of somebody who gets it and who knows. And I was sitting in a meeting at the end of the day on Friday in exactly that situation. And there's something that happens when I can sit there with a parent or a child or a carer or whoever it is, and they're sharing their experiences of what life is like for them. And I can say, I understand, and I get that it's really hard. And the thing that I've learned in pretty much every single meeting is there is no more important moment in that meeting with the parent or that child than that. I had a conversation with Carrie a couple of weeks ago, and I said one sentence to her, And she got it. And I didn't need to use any extra words. I didn't need to explain anything else. She saw me. She got it. In that moment, I felt validated. I felt like my emotions were validated. She barely said anything. She just looked at me. And there was just something so powerful about that moment of connection. And in that moment, there was a little bit of me that experienced some healing, that felt a little bit of hope. There was a lot of me that just felt as though I wasn't on my own because somebody else really got it and really understood. And I wonder whether you can think of times in your life when you found yourselves in conversation with people and you don't need to use all those extra words. It is such a powerful thing. Empathy can sometimes be everything. And as I've been reflecting on the story of Esther and of the idea of those really difficult things in life, all of a sudden becoming something that God can really use if we allow him to. And it is painful and it is difficult. But going back to those themes of hope and restoration, because of our difficult bits, we can help offer hope to other people. That connection that we make with each other and those around us can bring that hope and that healing. Because there's a bit of me that wonders whether in doing that, it takes the power away from those difficult things. And the reason I wanted to put on the wall there what Iona drew is I've got written down one of my favourite verses, which is, "The light shines in the darkness and the darkness will not overcome it." And when we're surrounded by that difficult reality of life, the hope can come from knowing that we can bring good from that. And part of that can come from the way that we are with each other. Because in our connection with other people, we can experience that hope and restoration just as much as they can. And I think there's a bit of magic in that. I know magic's maybe not the right word, but it is. It's amazing. When I can offer my difficult experiences to the parents and the children that I work with, and I don't tell them about them, but it just makes a difference to them and makes a difference in their life, and that's precious. And that's a way of me offering a little bit of the kingdom of God wherever I find myself. And so as we come to maybe worship now, if that's all right, Noreen, I'm just going to finish with a couple of final thoughts and then a verse from Corinthians, or a couple of verses from Corinthians. And as I was preparing for this morning, there was a word that just I had in my mind, and it was the word encountered, and I couldn't work out why. And then as I was finishing sorting everything out for this morning, it suddenly just dawned on me that there's something about encountering God and encountering the kingdom of God that is just so powerful. And as we come up to Easter weekend and as we work through Lent, when Jesus came to earth and he walked with us, that is the most powerful example of that connection. And when Jesus died on the cross and rose again, that is another incredibly powerful example of where something terrible happened, but from it something absolutely incredible took place, which is that we can have a real encounter with God. And what an opportunity we have to be able to go out and to share that with the people that we meet in our lives. It's amazing. I mean, it's risky, but it's amazing. So just to finish, Paul said to the church in Corinth, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it, and by it he means a thorn in his flesh. I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults and in hardships." So as we come to just a time of worship and a time of song, I wonder whether just having a think and a reflect on the opportunities that we might have in our lives to be able to share and connect with those around us.